Discover Geography, Lesson 6-3, Development Strategies. In our last lesson, we talked about the role that colonialism played in creating the economic inequality that we see in the world today, in accumulating wealth to certain parts of the world and impoverishing other parts of the world. So development is going to need to in some way reverse this. It's going to in some way need to add wealth to the poorer parts of the world. This process begins generally as countries begin to gain their independence from their old colonial rulers. A colonial ruler generally doesn't want their colonies to become wealthy and to become a competitor to the colonial ruler. They want to keep them in a state of economic dependence and subservience, funneling wealth towards the colonizer. But over the course of the 1800s, for the most part in the Americas, and then into the 1900s in the Caribbean and in Africa and Asia, most of the major European colonies in the world achieved their independence. But what they typically found was that even after achieving formal political independence, even after they were no longer directly ruled by their old colonial rulers, they were still in a state of neo-colonialism. They were still in a state in which their economies were still organized to funnel wealth towards their old colonial rulers. So they may be able to choose their own leaders now and have that sort of independence, but at the same time, their economic infrastructure is still geared towards enriching their old rulers. They have the infrastructure for things like mining and plantation farming. They have the infrastructure to transport that stuff to ports to ship it out. But they don't have things like manufacturing facilities to turn those raw materials into finished goods. They don't have banks to finance new economic enterprises. And so to only gain your formal political independence doesn't do a lot for your economic development. So initially, the strategy that was tried by many countries was something called import substitution. They took a look at their situation and they said, well, we got into this mess because of an unequal trade relationship with our former colonial ruler. We got into this situation of poverty because we are engaged in a trade relationship that tends to benefit the powerful and richer countries at our expense. And so what we need to do is we need to break off those relationships. We need to stop trading with countries that are much wealthier than ourselves until we get wealthy as well. So trade between equals is great. Trade across a big economic gap like that is what leads to exploitation. It leads to impoverishment of the poorer country and enrichment of the richer country. Now, in order to cut off that kind of trade, the poorer countries now needed to find substitutes for the things they used to import. The usual pattern was the colonies would produce raw materials, they'd ship them off to the colonizers, who would then transform them into finished manufactured goods and then sell them back to the colonies at a markup. So they needed their own manufacturing base to produce their own products, so they didn't need to import them anymore, and they needed their own financial system to finance this economic development. So the philosophy of import substitution was an attempt to substitute domestically produced goods for things that used to be imported by first increasing tariffs and import quotas. A tariff is a tax on imports. It charges extra money to someone trying to bring in foreign goods. And so by putting a high tariff on imports, you make imports less competitive with domestically produced goods. It makes imports artificially more expensive, so then people will prefer to buy the domestic goods, so then that money will get directed into supporting those domestic industries and not get sucked off through buying of imports and end up going to the old colonizer countries who were the producers of these imports. Import quotas are simply numerical restrictions on how many of a particular product you can import, and that had that same effect. By limiting and driving up the price of imports, you give an advantage to domestic industries. You help channel spending into those industries to help boost them, to help them get up and running and successfully provide domestically produced goods for your people. Second, import substitution involved limits on foreign investment. So if a foreign company wanted to invest in building a new factory in your country, for example, there would be limits on how much money they could put into that, limits on how much of an ownership stake they could have in that company, limits on how much control they could have over this factory that they were investing in. The idea here was that if a foreign company invests in a factory in your country, then that factory makes some money, some of those profits are going to go to those foreign investors. They're going to leave your country. They're going to go enrich people who are probably living in some of these former colonizer countries, because those are the countries with lots of wealth and well-developed financial systems that can do this kind of investment. So you want to keep your investment local. You want to make sure the profits that these new domestic enterprises are generating are going to stay within your country. Third, the government would give generous subsidies to companies that they wanted to encourage, and would even outright own some of the major industries. They would be government-controlled industries rather than private companies. This was because the government was at this point the only institution with enough power and enough access to wealth to get a lot of these industries up and running. The government could accumulate money through taxation and through borrowing from foreign sources in order to invest and make these companies run. And then in order to ensure these companies were going to run for the good of the country, the government would maintain control over them. And finally, under import substitution, these countries instituted generous social safety net programs in order to spread the wealth that they were generating around. So social safety net programs are things like free or cheap education, free or cheap health care, welfare payments to the poor. Under this import substitution package of policies, many of these former colonies went through some rapid industrial development. They established industries that they had never had before. They now had car companies and steel companies and banks that they had not had during the colonial and neo-colonial eras. Unfortunately, they also got themselves into a lot of debt. Financing the development of these new industries cost a lot of upfront money. And these were poor countries, so they didn't have that money already on hand. That was their whole problem, their whole reason they were pursuing this development. And so they ended up borrowing it from international institutions and from individual richer countries. Now, the idea in borrowing this money was that they would invest it in development, and then the profits from that development, the wealth it generated, would allow them to pay back the loan with interest. Unfortunately, that's not quite how it worked out. Import substitution did not generate profits as rapidly as was hoped. It didn't generate the kind of money that was necessary to pay off these debts, even when that money was invested well. Unfortunately, it was not always invested well. The leaders of many of these countries pursuing import substitution were often dictators. So they would siphon off a lot of that money into corruption, into building fancy palaces for themselves, into bribes, into paying off their cronies. And so that money that was never even invested was certainly never going to turn a profit that would allow it to easily be paid back. So by the 1980s, many of these countries, and you see here the example of Latin America, got deeply into debt. In the first picture, you see the situation in 1982, and the map shows debt service as a percent of total GDP. So debt service is essentially your minimum payment on that loan. So that's not the total amount that these countries owed. This was just the minimum payment that they had to keep making to keep current on these loans they had taken out. And you see some countries, it was almost up to 100% of their annual GDP that they owed to these lenders. Obviously, it's not feasible for them to take 100% of all of the wealth that is exchanged in that country in 1 year and turn that over to their creditors. And so a number of these countries, starting with Mexico, essentially declared bankruptcy. They said, we cannot pay these loans back. There is nothing we can do. We literally do not have the money to be able to pay back these loans. And because of the problems of import substitution and because of this debt crisis, these countries looked for ways to reorganize their debts and to reorganize their economies to allow them to pay down the debts. In terms purely of debt, you can see that these countries have made some significant progress by the present day. In the second picture, you see debt service as a percent of GDP in a more recent year, and you can see that in nearly every country it's gone down quite a bit. Neoliberalism is the philosophy that arose in response to the struggles that countries were having under the import substitution system. So whereas import substitution was based on an idea of restricting the market, on an idea of restricting exploitative trade relationships, neoliberalism is a free market philosophy. Neoliberalism is a philosophy that says the best path to prosperity is to allow markets to do their thing free of government intervention. Now, the term neoliberalism is a reference to the original concept of liberalism. When that term was first coined in the 17 and 1800s, it was used to refer to a primarily free market economy. It was the philosophy of the emerging capitalist class who was pushing back against the restrictions that were being placed on them by the aristocracy during the initial development of capitalism and the industrial system. And so neoliberalism is kind of a revival of that philosophy. So it's important to keep that history in mind, since in the United States we're used to using the word liberal to mean politically on the left, even though liberals are often not so much neoliberals. Liberals often want more regulation of the economy. Neoliberals would want less regulation. It's also important to keep in mind the distinction between neoliberalism, which is a philosophy of economic policy, and the term neoconservatism, which is an essentially unrelated term, even though they both begin with neo and both have a term that's widely used for one side of the political spectrum in the United States. Neoconservatism is a foreign policy philosophy that says that democracy can be spread through the use of military force. So something like the US invasion of Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein and bring democracy to Iraq. That was a neoconservative project. So someone can easily be both neoliberal and neoconservative. George W. Bush, who you see on the slide there, was a neoliberal because he supported expansion of free markets, and a neoconservative because he supported things like the war in Iraq. Neoliberalism produced a specific package of reforms for countries that were having trouble with their economies that was known as structural adjustment. And we can think of a structural adjustment policy as being effectively the opposite of an import substitution philosophy. So, as a neoliberal approach, structural adjustment aimed to unleash the power of the global free market by first eliminating tariffs and import quotas. So, under a neoliberal philosophy, tariffs and import quotas are restrictions on the market. They prevent people from getting access to the best goods, and they shelter domestic industries from beneficial competition. So according to a neoliberal philosophy, if you eliminate tariffs and then cheap foreign goods can be imported, that's going to spur your own companies to have to work harder to produce better products at a lower price in order to compete, lest they risk going out of business. And that's a beneficial thing, that competition. Second, structural adjustment policies required countries to open themselves up to foreign investment. So under the neoliberal philosophy, if a foreign investor wants to put money into your country, wants to help build a factory, wants to help create jobs for your people, that's a benefit to you. And the overall increase in economic activity that generates is going to be beneficial to both sides in this arrangement. So these restrictions on foreign investment need to be discarded under a structural adjustment policy. Third, government subsidies to industry need to be cut, and privatizing of government industries needs to happen. So industries that were heavily controlled by the government need to be handed over to someone else to be run on their own and to succeed or fail in the free market. Subsidies need to be gotten rid of so that inefficient companies aren't being propped up by the government, aren't being kept afloat when competition ought to drive them to either improve or go out of business. And finally, the government should reduce its spending in order to reduce its tax rates in order to get out of the way of the market. So you can see these are all essentially the opposite of the policies that were adopted under import substitution. These policies were adopted by some countries willingly. Some countries embraced structural adjustment as a way to reform their economies and to turn things around and generate wealth. Other countries embraced them under duress. Creditors, rich countries and international institutions that had loaned money to countries during the import substitution era, often required, as a part of the terms of renegotiating the debt, the countries adopt structural adjustment policies. The deal was essentially, if you adopt this package of policies, if you reform your economy like this, then we'll be willing to cut you a break on the debt. We'll forgive some of your debt. We'll renegotiate to a lower interest rate or a lower rate of payments. And so that'll help you out. It'll help you pay off your debt. It'll help us recover more money for your debt. And it will, according to a neoliberal philosophy, improve your economy so that you're able to generate more wealth and therefore handle your debts better and move into a more prosperous situation. Not all countries agreed that this was the best way to go, but they often found that they had little choice. Their creditors were insisting that they adopt this or else go into default on their debts. So as we saw, these kind of policies did help countries renegotiate their debts, help them get out of the severe debt crisis that struck many parts of the world in the 1980s. Under a neoliberal philosophy, there's been a great promotion of free trade agreements, agreements between countries to reduce or eliminate tariffs and quotas. This is something that a neoliberal philosophy would like to see be extended to the entire world. Right now, we have kind of a patchwork of different free trade areas where tariffs and quotas have been virtually eliminated between countries. Meanwhile, tariffs and quotas between countries that are parts of different free trade agreements are also being lowered as well. One of the more notable ones, and the one that's most relevant to us in the United States, is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This went into effect at the beginning of 1994, and it connects Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So these three countries agreed to greatly reduce barriers to the movement of money and goods across their borders. So you can now import goods from one of those countries to another without having to pay a tariff. You can invest money from one country into another without being restricted or having to pay excessive fees. The overall effects of NAFTA have been very complex and very controversial. The best estimates we have is that there was overall a gain in jobs in Mexico as many industries moved down there seeking cheaper labor, and an overall somewhat loss of jobs in the United States and Canada, and a lot of churn, a lot of change in the types of jobs available, often to jobs that are less secure and lower paying. NAFTA also opened Mexico to a big influx of cheap U.S. agricultural goods, especially corn. This put many poor farmers in Mexico out of a job and helped to stimulate more migration from Mexico to the United States. Even though NAFTA did not change immigration laws, did not make it any easier for people to migrate between the countries, the push factors that were generated by the shifts in the export of goods stimulated this greater migration. Another result of neoliberalism has been increased economic growth in many of the countries that have adopted these policies. You can see in that first picture there that GDP growth in the poorer countries of Latin America is higher than it is in the richer countries of North America. So these countries are seeing their economies gain in terms of overall wealth levels. But at the same time, they're also seeing increases in inequality. This wealth is accumulating to some people, the people that are able to take advantage of the new rules, the people that are able to control the businesses that are making the big profits, whereas many other people are getting left behind. So we see increasing Gini coefficients in countries under neoliberalism. Another model of development that has succeeded in other parts of the world is what we refer to as the East Asian model, because it was initially adopted by Japan, then moved to South Korea and Taiwan, and is currently being pursued by China and various countries in Southeast Asia. The East Asian model incorporates certain elements from import substitution and certain elements from neoliberalism. So like import substitution, It's a model in which there's heavy government support for key companies, key industries that the country wishes to promote, wishes to boost, wishes to make sure are going to succeed, get a lot of support from the government in these countries. However, these are not industries focused on providing for the needs of the domestic population the way they would be under import substitution. These are industries focused on export, specifically export to richer countries. So the government will boost these industries so that they can produce stuff that they can sell to places like the United States or Western Europe, which will bring in profits that will then boost the country's economy. That's the basic idea of the East Asian model. The East Asian model is based around an idea of the various companies within the country cooperating in certain ways. So rather than competing with each other within the country, the aim is for these countries to cooperate in order to boost the production of these companies and make it easier for them to export. And so in Japan, the organizations that were created to facilitate this were called keiretsu. And they were similar organizations with different names in local languages in other countries that have pursued this model. A keiretsu is a set of companies organized around a central bank that's providing financing to them all. So for example, the Mitsubishi keiretsu involves the Mitsubishi Car Company, Kirin Beer Company, Nikon Cameras, NEOS Gas, and a number of other companies. They're all receiving their financing from the same central bank, and so that bank allows those companies to essentially support each other. If Mitsubishi's not doing so well at one point in time, but Nikon is doing great, then the finances can flow to support Mitsubishi through the tough times. So this kind of cooperative model helped to boost industry in these countries, helped to get these countries up and running with industries that they had not had before this time. Because many of these countries began as some of the poorest countries in the world. Japan, after the end of World War II, for example, was one of the poorer countries in the world. And yet today, it's one of the richest countries per capita in the world because of this East Asian development model. So we've been looking at general policies to promote development, general philosophical approaches at the government level to promoting development. We also might want to look at specific projects that might be carried out by the government or by another institution to help boost the economy of an area, to help generate more development. And we can distinguish these kinds of products into top-down approaches to development and bottom-up approaches. Top-down approaches are ones in which some outside entity, such as the government or an non-governmental organization, an international organization, a charity, something, comes in and says, here's what we're going to do. We have this idea that we want to implement that is going to help you. So one example of that is the building of dams. This has been a very popular thing that's been done by the governments of many countries. What you see in this picture is the very controversial Sardar Sarovar Dam in India. The government of India had been working on this dam for decades. Since shortly after Indian independence, the Indian government decided that building this dam would be a great economic boon to the country. It would generate hydroelectric power to fuel industry. It would reduce flooding downstream of the dam. And it would generate irrigation water to expand farming. And so they put a lot of effort into building this dam, despite a high level of resistance from the people living in this area who felt that the dam was not going to be helpful to their prospects, many of whom were displaced by the filling of the lake behind the dam. Their traditional fields that their families had lived in for generations were now flooded by the construction of this dam, and they were forced to move elsewhere, often with very little help from the government to find a new place and get set up. So one of the common problems with the top-down approach is that the people creating this approach don't fully understand the needs of the people that they claim that they're working on behalf of. Another good example of this from a non-government source is certain charity efforts in which a well-meaning person from outside of the target country comes up with an idea of what they think is going to help the target country and carries out this project without really consulting the people in the target place about whether this project is genuinely going to help them. So as one example, and this is one of many examples, I'm not picking on this guy in particular, but the guy you see in the photo here a few years ago organized a campaign over Twitter around the hashtag 1,000,000 shirts. His idea was to have people take t-shirts that they weren't using anymore, because in the United States, we get t-shirts all the time from various things we do, and we may not even need them or wear them. They just go in our closet. And so we said, everybody, send me your extra t-shirts and $1 to help pay for shipping. I'm going to collect 1 million of these, and then I'm going to ship them off to needy people in Africa. So this sounded to him, and like to the people that supported this, like this is a great idea. He's going to get all of these shirts together, and he's going to give them to all these poor people. It's going to be something that helps these people. Well, in fact, some of this kind of charity, just giving shirts to people in Africa, is not actually what people in Africa needed. Africa's problem is not really a lack of shirts. There are shirts to be had in Africa. And in fact, if you flood the market with all these free charity t-shirts, you're going to put local shirt manufacturers out of business. So you're ultimately going to hurt some of the very people that you are trying to help. So a top-down approach in which an outsider decides they know what's good for the community they're trying to help often runs into major problems in terms of actually succeeding at development. On the other hand, a bottom-up approach is one that begins with the needs of the people who are going to be benefited by this. When those people are in control of how the project is developed, it tends to meet their needs better and tends to produce better results. So as one example, the fair trade movement in coffee and chocolate and now other products began from farmers who were growing these products trying to find a way to get a better return on their work, to get more money out of what they were doing to lift themselves out of poverty. And so because it was being driven by the desires and the needs and the concerns of the people who are meant to be benefited, it's been more successful than things like sending large shipments of unwanted t-shirts to poor areas. Another popular approach that in some ways blends aspects of some of these different strategies that we've talked about is microcredit. Microcredit is a system of giving very small loans to poor people, especially poor women, to help them start small businesses. It's traditionally very difficult for very poor people to get any sort of loan from a bank. The amount of money that they may be asking for is going to be incredibly small. And so the amount of interest that they'd end up paying on it, if they paid it back normally, would also be very small. So it's often not worth it for banks to make these tiny little loans because they're not going to make much profit off it for all of the paperwork that they have to do. In addition to that, poor people are less likely to be able to pay back these loans because they have less flexibility. They have less of a cushion. If something bad happens that adds to their expenses, suddenly they no longer have the money to pay back this loan. They end up defaulting on these loans at a higher rate than richer people who could more easily find that extra money somewhere to keep current on their loans. And so banks wouldn't lend to very poor people or would only lend to them at exorbitant interest rates that would essentially drive those people further into poverty. Microcredit is a system that was designed to make these tiny loans available to very poor people. And the way it does this is by organizing borrowers into groups like this. What you see here is a microcredit group in a particular location in Bangladesh, which is where the idea of microcredit really got going. So the microcredit organization, which is essentially a bank, is now willing to make small loans to these people because they know that they will be held accountable and helped by the other members of the group. The group knows that they're all in it together. Even though the loan's going to just one person, they're all in it together. Their own ability to get loans now or in the future is in part dependent on their other members staying current with their loans. So they can exert social pressure on each other to invest their money wisely and to pay back the loan on time. And they can help each other out. If somebody runs into problems and literally can't pay back their loan, they can look for help to the other members of the microcredit group. This made it more profitable for these banks to start making these tiny little loans. And with these little loans, these women were able to do things like buy a goat so that she could start selling milk or cheese to make extra income, or buy a bicycle taxi so that she could start transporting people and earning money that way, or buy a sewing machine to get into clothing manufacture and repair as a small business. So microcredit taps into the social organization of poor communities, but in the service of getting them into the market as successful entrepreneurs. Neoliberalism has faced a lot of resistance from various people. So we see around the world movements against the expansion of neoliberalism, movements against the effects of structural adjustment policies. Because while it's generated economic growth for some people, it's also left many people out. It's created economic inequalities that disadvantage some people. So we see some resistance coming kind of bottom up from revolutionary factions within countries. So you see here in this picture some of the members of the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico. The Zapatista movement was launched on the day that NAFTA went into effect as a way of resisting NAFTA, of trying to exclude this neoliberal system of economic policy from the areas controlled by the Zapatistas' military rebel faction. On the other hand, you also see national leaders resisting neoliberalism, trying to swing the pendulum back towards something closer to an import substitution approach. So one of the most famous leaders to do that is this fellow here, Evo Morales, who's the president of Bolivia. And he's made a lot of steps to try to reinstitute some of the market controls that neoliberalism has tried to get rid of in his home country. Whether this resistance to neoliberalism will succeed, whether the pendulum of the world will swing back away from neoliberalism, remains to be seen.